For decades, the United States and Canada have been locked in an unbreakable trade alliance. Fuel, steel, electricity, food, and critical resources flowing seamlessly across the border. But something just changed. Behind closed doors, classified. Economic briefings have sent shockwaves through Washington. Canada is no longer playing by the old rules. And if this continues, the consequences could be catastrophic. Right now, as you watch this, the White House is scrambling for a response. American industries are about to face shortages, skyrocketing costs, and supply chain chaos, all because of one decision that Canada made in secret. But here's the part no one is talking about. This isn't just about trade. If Canada follows through with its next move, the global balance of power will shift forever. And the worst part? China and Russia are already positioning themselves to take full advantage of this crisis. Washington thought it had time. They were wrong. And what's coming next is something no one saw coming. The crisis has begun. But what no one realizes yet is that this isn't just about trade. It's an economic war. And Canada just made its first major strike. Washington assumed it could control the situation. They thought a few tariffs would pressure Canada into compliance. But behind closed doors, Ottawa has been preparing for this moment for years. The first signs of retaliation were subtle. Key trade negotiations with European and Asian nations accelerated overnight. Suddenly, Canada wasn't just adjusting its economy, it was realigning itself with a new global order. Government officials in Washington dismissed these moves as posturing, a political show for the media. But inside classified financial briefings, the reality was sinking in. Canada was moving fast, cutting reliance on the US economy, shifting its exports, and reinforcing economic partnerships that made American industries vulnerable. The first real blow came in the form of energy. Washington's worst nightmare was about to come true. For decades, Canada has been one of the biggest suppliers of crude oil, natural gas, and electricity to the US. The relationship has been so deeply embedded in North America's energy grid that no one ever questioned what would happen if it suddenly changed. And then it did. Quietly, without much media attention, Canada began redirecting key oil exports to Europe and Asia. The shift wasn't dramatic, just a few percentage points. But inside Washington, the alarms were going off. A small reduction in Canadian energy exports to the US had an immediate impact. Gas prices in key regions spiked. Oil refiners warned of potential shortages. Investors panicked, and then came the electricity crisis. In states like New York, Vermont, and Michigan, Canadian hydroelectric power is critical to keeping the grid stable. But suddenly, those power agreements were no longer guaranteed. Canada's government hinted at reviewing energy priorities, language that sent chills through the White House. If Canada pulled its electricity supply, blackouts would hit the Northeast within weeks. Washington had underestimated Canada's leverage. But the real shock was still coming, because this wasn't just about energy. As the crisis unfolded, Canadian officials were negotiating a new economic deal with China. A move that would send an unmistakable message to Washington. Canada wasn't waiting for the US anymore. The final blow came with critical resources: steel, aluminum, and industrial metals that American manufacturers depended on. Automakers, construction firms, defense contractors, suddenly their supply chains were in jeopardy. Washington scrambled for answers. But the truth was undeniable. The first strike had landed, and America wasn't ready for what was coming next. And now a far bigger crisis was about to begin. The first strike had landed, but Washington still didn't grasp the full scale of the crisis. They assumed the situation could be controlled. They were wrong, because now the impact was no longer just in trade deals or government negotiations. It was hitting the streets. Across the US, industries that had relied on Canadian resources for decades were suddenly struggling to function. The cracks in the system weren't just forming, they were spreading like wildfire. At first, it started with small supply disruptions, slight delays in shipments, minor price increases. But within days, the ripple effects became clear. In auto, plants across Michigan and Ohio, production lines slowed to a halt. The problem? A critical shortage of Canadian aluminum and steel. The US auto industry had been deeply integrated with Canadian suppliers for generations. Without Canadian metals, production costs skyrocketed. Manufacturers had to scramble to find alternative suppliers, but the only real options were China and Brazil. That meant longer shipping times, higher tariffs, massive price hikes. And it wasn't just the auto industry. In construction, major projects were now under threat. High-rise developments, highway expansions, military infrastructure all depended on a steady flow of Canadian steel. But now deliveries were drying up, and with every delay, costs kept climbing. Then came the energy crisis. Gas prices had already spiked after Canada shifted oil exports away from the US. But as refineries struggled to adjust, the price at the pump kept climbing. By the second week of the crisis, gas had jumped by nearly $1 per gallon in some regions. Truck drivers, already dealing with rising costs, were forced to increase freight prices. That meant one thing: everything was about to become more expensive. Food distribution networks took a direct hit. Supermarkets in the Midwest and Northeast reported early shortages of fresh produce, dairy, and meat. Prices on basic necessities rose overnight. And as panic set in, people rushed to stock up, making the crisis even worse. The White House held emergency meetings trying to reassure the public that this was temporary. But internally, Washington was facing a terrifying reality. This wasn't just a supply chain issue anymore. It was a full-blown economic disaster. With costs rising and shortages growing, the financial markets reacted violently. The stock market tumbled as investors realized the depth of the crisis. The Dow suffered its biggest one-day drop in months. Financial analysts warned that if the crisis continued, it could trigger a full-scale recession. But the worst part? This was just the beginning. Because now foreign nations were watching America struggle, and one of them was about to make its move. Washington was on the edge. The economy was unraveling, supply chains were fractured, and investors were in full-blown panic. The crisis had moved beyond trade. This was now a battle for economic survival. The White House had no choice but to act. Backing down meant surrendering global influence. Fighting back meant risking total escalation. The first move came fast. The Federal Reserve launched an emergency stabilization plan. Interest rates were adjusted, liquidity was injected into key markets, and officials held urgent meetings with Wall Street leaders. The message was clear: America would not collapse. But this wasn't just about calming investors. The real war was unfolding on the trade front. Washington announced a new wave of retaliatory tariffs, not just on Canada, but on any nation supporting its economic shift. These measures targeted energy, manufacturing, and financial services, aiming to cripple Canada's newfound independence. The response was immediate. Global markets reacted violently. European leaders hesitated, caught between economic ties with the US and the opportunity to strengthen trade with Canada. China and Russia moved swiftly, offering Canada stronger trade deals, financial backing, and strategic partnerships. What Washington feared most was happening. This was no longer a US-Canada trade dispute. It was a full-scale economic realignment. Behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts intensified. High-level US officials landed in Ottawa, demanding negotiations to end the crisis before irreversible damage was done. But Canada wasn't yielding. For the first time in modern history, a major US ally was rejecting Washington's pressure. Ottawa held its ground, refusing to reverse its economic pivot. Panic spread through Washington. More drastic measures were put on the table, restricting Canadian access to US financial markets, limiting American investments in Canadian industries, reassessing key military agreements. Each move carried devastating risks, but at this stage the US had no other options. The final decision was approaching: escalate the crisis further, or attempt a last-minute deal. But the US now faced a deeper, more terrifying reality. For the first time, America needed Canada more than Canada needed America. And if Washington made the wrong move now, it could trigger the biggest geopolitical shift in decades. Washington had made its move, but it wasn't enough. The crisis was still spreading, and now the consequences were impossible to contain. America's worst nightmare was becoming reality. Canada was breaking free. For decades, the US had controlled the economic relationship, dictating trade terms and ensuring that Canada remained dependent. But now, the balance of power was shifting. The White House had underestimated just how much leverage Canada held. Oil, electricity, steel, food, critical minerals, these weren't just trade goods. They were lifelines. And now, those lifelines were being cut. The US had imposed crippling new tariffs to force Canada back in line. But Canada didn't flinch. Instead, it doubled down on its global realignment. New agreements with Europe, China, and emerging markets had replaced American trade faster than Washington expected. The shock was immediate. Energy markets spiraled as US oil refiners struggled to replace lost Canadian crude. Gas prices kept rising. Electricity shortages loomed in the Northeast. Auto and construction industries, once the backbone of American manufacturing, faced brutal supply constraints. Prices soared, jobs were cut, and production slowed. But the biggest blow came with food supplies. Grocery prices had already been climbing. But as Canadian agricultural exports were redirected elsewhere, America was left scrambling for replacements. Meat, dairy, wheat, essential produce, all became more expensive. Food shortages hit hardest in urban centers, where reliance on steady imports was highest. Washington was running out of options. Diplomatic channels were collapsing. Canadian leaders were now openly discussing a trade future without the US at the center. Foreign investors took notice. For years, the world had viewed the US economy as an unshakable force. But now, major global players were starting to question that assumption. China accelerated its shift away from the dollar. Russia strengthened energy deals with Canada and Europe. Even US allies started looking for alternatives. The markets reacted with fear. The dollar weakened. Bond markets wobbled. Wall Street braced for an extended downturn. This wasn't just about trade anymore. It was about America's place in the world. And for the first time, that position was starting to crack. A decision had to be made. Washington could attempt a last-minute deal, offering concessions to bring Canada back into the fold. Or it could escalate further, risking a full-blown financial conflict that could send shockwaves through the global economy. Neither choice was safe. But one thing was certain. If the US lost control now, the economic order of North America would never be the same again. The battle had been fought. The economic war had reshaped everything. But the question now was, what happens next? Washington had thrown every weapon it had at Canada. Tariffs, financial restrictions, diplomatic pressure. None of it had worked. Canada had held its ground, strengthened global partnerships, and survived without US dependence. And now, America was facing the consequences. The immediate impact was clear. Supply chains remained fractured, prices stayed high, and industries struggled to recover. The energy sector was in chaos. With Canadian oil exports permanently reduced, the US had been forced to secure new supplies at higher costs. Gas prices remained unstable, and fuel shortages in some regions became the new normal. The auto and construction industries continued their downward spiral. Companies faced higher costs, delayed projects, and lower profit margins. Some smaller. Manufacturers had shut down entirely. And then there was the food crisis. Supermarket shelves weren't empty, but prices had permanently shifted upward. Meat, dairy, wheat, and fresh produce, all staples that once flowed easily from Canada, were now more expensive. For the average American, life was getting harder. But the biggest shift wasn't happening in grocery stores or gas stations. It was happening on Wall Street. Investors had watched in disbelief as the US struggled to maintain dominance in the global economy. Foreign nations took notes. If Canada could break free, who else could follow? China accelerated its shift away from the US dollar. Russia deepened economic ties with Canada and Europe. Even traditional US allies began diversifying trade agreements to reduce dependence on American markets. The White House was losing influence, and the world could see it. Washington now had to make an impossible decision. It could accept this new reality, adapting to a world where the US was no longer the center of global trade. Or it could launch an even bigger economic counterstrike, doubling down on pressure, making new alliances, and trying to regain control. Both choices carried massive risks. But one thing was clear. The days of uncontested US economic dominance were over, and the fight for the future, it was just beginning.